We all want to feel peace in our lives, peace in our choices, our beliefs, our relationships, and our environment. I've learned that this desired contentment is often found through holding on to less. When we pare down what we own, what we consume, and what we value, we're left with what's intentional, a personalized curation of what is important and true and useful to us. I'm Shannon Leyko, and you're listening to Paring Down, a podcast aimed at helping you declutter not only your home, but any area of your life that's overwhelming. Here, we're having interesting and honest conversations about the physical and mental clutter that drowns out what truly matters to each of us. And together, we'll learn how to pare it all down, not for the sake of perfection or becoming rigid, rather so we can move through life with less overwhelm and more joy, wisdom, and peace. Hey guys, I teased this episode a little bit last week, but this week on the podcast is Jen Smith, and she is co-host of the Frugal Friends podcast. If you've been a listener of mine, you've probably heard me mention Frugal Friends because, well, our podcast here on Paring Down really focuses primarily on the decluttering side of minimalish, intentional living. The Frugal Friends podcast does an amazing job focusing on that consumption piece and how we can be more mindful with how we spend our money, which of course feeds into what shows up in our homes. So Jen and her co-host Jill wrote a book that's coming out January 7th that I already pre-ordered, and you should too, called How to Buy What You Love Without Going Broke. The second they announced that this book was coming out, I was like, A, ordering it, obviously. B, I want to get them on the podcast to talk about it. So we got Jen here today, and that is a treat. I'm going to let her kind of tell you more about the book during the interview. And of course, even if you don't like to read or you don't end up buying the book, this is still jam-packed with tons of helpful perspective shifts and mindsets about how to spend our money in wise and value-based ways, which again, all feeds into this intentional living and underscores all of the important things that we talk about here on Paring Down all the time. And as this is coming out, it's kind of in the holiday season. And I just want to say that buying a book for someone you love is a really fantastic gift. I personally love receiving books because I don't like to spend my money on books. I tend to get them at the library, but nonfiction books are really easy to pass along too, so they don't just like become clutter in your house if you don't think you'll read them again. Or for me, I love to highlight them and go back and reference them. So the majority of books I do have on my shelf are the nonfiction books because I find them easier to reference. And I just think this would be a really great gift idea. She did not tell me to say this. I'm telling you out of just honest opinion that you can pre-order this book and it'll ship on January 7th. And I've done this before where I just like print out a picture of the book and cut it out, fold it up, put it in an envelope for a stocking stuffer, something like that. That is a great way to support an author that has a book coming out right after the holidays, while also giving a really mindful and thoughtful gift. Okay, now that I'm done like trying to be their PR team they never even wanted, I'm going to go ahead and just press play on this fabulous interview with Jen Smith of the Frugal Friends podcast. All right, Jen, thank you so much for being here. I'm giggling, everyone, because I just wanted to confirm how to pronounce Jen Smith, and I think we've got it under control. So hi, Jen Smith. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. First time, man. It's good pronunciation skills.
Thank you so much. I am so proud of my literacy. Anyways, could you tell us a little bit just about yourself? And I know you have your co-author, Jill Sirianni, who you guys are, and a little bit about your new book, Buy What You Love Without Going Broke. I love that title.
Yeah, thank you so much. So Jill and I started the Frugal Friends podcast about 6.5 years ago. And it was right after I had paid off my husband and I paid off $78,000 of debt. And we really wanted to help people like save better, people who were on the same journey as us. Jill and I really bonded over our shared like debt payoffs. She was still paying off debt. And we just wanted to make this part of personal finance feel less isolating, because a lot of personal finance revolves around earn more and invest and retire as early as possible, pay off debt. But nobody really talked about saving money. Saving money like wasn't sexy because it was synonymous with deprivation. And so that's how Frugal Friends started. And over this 6.5 year journey, we, from trying to make it feel like not deprivation, we ourselves evolved into, okay, spending as little as possible, or maybe spending even just less, may not be the answer for everyone. Sometimes it's spending on what you value. And that is the key to making spending quote unquote less feel not like deprivation. So we've really been on this 4-year journey to refining, like, what is values-based spending? How do you spend in alignment with your values? How do you do it when there are obligations and you can't easily say no to things that may fall outside of your values? How do you figure out what you value? Because we started with like a core values list, like that corporations use for their mission statements. And we found really quickly that wasn't the right route. So it's just been a 4-year journey to refining this. And Buy What You Love Without Going Broke is truly the definitive guide on how to find what you value, how to use what you're already spending on, and what your like highest needs are to figure out what you value and how you want to show up in those values, how to say no to the things you don't value, and whether it's a straight no or it's a little murky of an area, how can we say stronger no's? And then how do we make the lifestyle sustainable? How do we continue going on with values-based spending, not just think of it as a great idea, but how do we actually integrate it into this life that is not lived in a vacuum, but is lived around other people in different places?
Okay, so basically, your approach to spending is my approach to decluttering. And this is why I was
Mm-hmm.
so excited to have you on the show because, and you mentioned this in chapter 7 of your book when you talk about, simplifying your environment and the trap of decluttering and minimalism being the end goal rather than what it should be, which is you're getting rid of the excess so you can focus on what you truly love. This isn't about just getting rid of stuff so you can say that you're morally superior because you own less stuff. Like, no, and so when it comes to spending, you're really getting rid of those excess expenditures in order to make room for spending on what actually matters to you. And I think that's fantastic. So, on that note, can you expand a little bit upon what values based spending is exactly? So, I love how you put in the book it's what you purchase instead of how much you purchase. But how can people know that they are in the values based spending world and doing that correctly?
Yeah. So, first, it's changing your mindset from spending is an identity, like I'm a spender, or spending is a moral failing or being irresponsible. Because in personal finance, people that are good with money save, and people who are bad with money spend. And that is false. Actually, we all spend money. Even those people that are quote unquote good with money and can joyfully live on beans and rice, they still spend money. And so, truly, spending is a skill. And so we believe values-based spending is just kind of that collection of spending as a skill and then also sub-skills. So like simplification is a skill, and cultivating community is a skill. So there's all these skills that surround spending that support it. And so that's what we believe values-based spending is. So first, if you can just get your mindset away from spending as an identity and spending as a skill, and then finding out what you value most. And not every not every purchase has to have this like super deep meaning, right? Like I needed I wanted a new laptop backpack. And did I like need it officially? See, like I even said like I needed like we just go right there because we want to justify in our minds all of our purchases, right? Or we feel guilty if we don't justify them. But honestly, like the backpack I have now, it functions. It's just ugly. Like it's the fake leather is peeling, and I never zip up my backpack. So it's always like, it's just the wrong, like it always is open, and it's my toxic trait. So like I wanted a better functioning backpack and one that wasn't like disintegrating. So I
That's
did. I got
fair.
one. Right.
Yes.
So we want to like justify these purchases sometimes like to the extreme, but then also sometimes to the opposite extreme. You can value anything, right? And yes, you will have some of those higher values that are obviously going to be most important to you, but you can also just buy things because you want to. And you can do that when you are prioritizing your purchases. And so when you're not falling prey to impulse spending that somebody else wants you to make, or like deceptive marketing, like cultural marketing that is rooted back like 100 years ago, that's just been ingrained in us that we don't even realize the routines we have now started as marketing campaigns, right? So when we can recognize that stuff and be cognizant of it, and then we can say intentionals, yeses, and nos to our purchases. So it's this combination of figuring out what you value most highly, and then also being informed to make these smaller decisions, and empowered and without guilt, to make the smaller ones.
Yeah, that word empowered is what sticks out to me there, because it is when you're intentional about something, when you know you're making the choice because it aligns with you and what you want, you're not just falling prey to, like you said, this consumerist advertising kind of a world that is so integrated in the way we live our lives, like you said, that we don't even notice it half the time, more than half the time, I would probably say,
Mm-hmm.
So what are some of those questions that we can ask ourselves to determine if a purchase does align with our values? Like you said, sometimes they're not that serious, but when we do want to make sure that we're moving forward in an intentional way, what questions can we ask ourselves?
So I will give an example, like a story. I love coffee. Like I love buying coffee out. I also love drinking coffee at home. I love it. And so when I was first starting to budget, keeping my coffee budget, category was really hard. I either very quickly overspent it, or I would just not spend on it at all because I would feel guilty because I don't want to spend it as quickly as I did last month. And I would just, and every time I made a coffee purchase, I would then feel guilty because I'm quote unquote not supposed to, because I only have this limited budget and I don't know what's going to happen in the future. So this was a really this small thing was really stressful to me. So when I identified what I valued, and for our highest values, we looked at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And at the base is like security and physiological needs. And so those in personal finance are usually, if you're a good quote unquote saver, and non-spender, you only spend on those. You only spend on the bottom tier, is things that physically are required to live. But above that, we find ourselves spending even if we're quote unquote not supposed to. So we've got relationships, we've got self-esteem, the feeling of achievement, and then at the very top, like self-actualization, the feeling like you're living into your full potential. And so even if we're not supposed to, and we try not to spend on those things, we will spend on them in ways to get them that actually don't really get at them directly. And so specifically on that hierarchy, we found that 4 things people were spending on to get, whether they realized it or not. And we even found this is how we stopped using that core values list, is because everyone was naming these same 4 things. And they're the 4 F's: family, friends, faith, and fulfilling work. So most people in some capacity those were their top 4 out of 5 for sure. And so when you use those as your North Star, they can guide in your saving and financial goals, but they can also guide you in your smaller purchases. So I realized after looking back at my transactions, the coffee purchases that I enjoyed most, that I associated with these best feelings, were the coffee dates with friends, or coming like to my, people coming to my house and, we have a cup of coffee. So it was the relational aspect. And so I realized that's actually what I'm going for. It's not the coffee per se. Yes, I love the coffee. If I had a choice between getting a coffee and a beer with someone, I know I'm going to choose the coffee. If it's martini, that's another story.
It's another story,
But,
especially if there's a Belucci
right.
stuffed olives. Thank you very much.
Wow. Okay. So yeah,
you can probably tell I just got back from vacation. Sorry. So my mind is with the martini currently. Sorry about that.
I love that state of mind. But so I know that I am going to pursue the value first. So now that I know that, I can first get creative in how I meet the value. I can look first for ways to meet that value without spending money or by spending as little money. And if I cannot meet the value those ways, I'm going to spend money on it without guilt. Like I am going to fill my cup as much as possible, but I want to optimize my limited dollars to get as much of what I value as possible. But when I do spend it on, I'm going to spend without guilt. And so that eliminated the coffee purchases that were just mindless, habitual, drive through, stop at the Starbucks at Target. Like that eliminated all of those. Do I still do that sometimes? Like when I'm having a hard day? Yes, I have my little treats, but I am 100% aware of them and intentional about them. And I will say no to a lot of other things so that I can afford my little coffee treats. So it's just that balance between, it's like not actual a list of 5 questions, but looking back at your transactions, looking back at the way they made you feel, what triggered them, and then you can use that as a guide to move on with your future transactions.
Yeah, and I definitely want to dive into that 90-day transaction inventory you guys talk about. But first, I want to stay here for a second about, first of all, the guilt that you mentioned, because particularly as women, which I have to say, I love that you are able to speak on this in a way that connects with everyone. My husband loves your podcast now too when he listens to it, because I do think that traditionally in the finance space, it's male dominated. I'm sure you experience that and know that very well,
Mm-hmm.
but as you do speak to women in particular, women struggle so much with guilt, especially when it comes to spending. And I love how you say it's okay to do that guilt-free spending, especially when you've identified that it's part of your values. Then go for it. We are only YOLO, right? Like we're only alive once. Like if you're going to spend your money, spend it happily on the things that matter most to you. And, I struggle with something, the chapter cracked me up that's called, But I Love Everything, because that is me.
Yeah.
Like, I'm like, but I love it all, And so I know this is more that Jill wrote about curiosity, but I'm sure you can speak to this. How does curiosity play a role in identifying where we should be spending our money?
Oh my gosh. So we are our biggest critics, right? We look at this 90-day transaction inventory that you just mentioned, where we look at all of our transactions for the last 90 days. And it is hard to look objectively with neutrality because we're looking, we're saying, why did I spend all this money on Amazon? Why did I go out to eat right after I went to the grocery store? Why am I doing this? And that's a really destructive way to learn more about your finances, learn more about the way you spend money. So the idea with getting curious, and this is literally right after we talk about rethinking about spending as a skill and learning what values are, we start right off with curiosity, because you have to ask yourself different questions to look at your actions with neutrality. Language is so powerful, and you can be kind of looking at the same results, but thinking about them in different ways just by the language you use to ask yourself these questions. And so we are strongly pro eliminating why questions when you're specifically thinking about yourself and thinking about your transactions. Why is not a bad question to ask, but when we ask those questions, it automatically puts us on the defense or on the guilt train. So we take that out and we look deeper, and we ask what and how questions. What was I doing before I made that purchase? How did I feel after it? What did I think that purchase was going to get me? We ask questions like that. That's how we get curious instead of judgmental. And that's a required skill to learn before you can move on and improve your spending.
Yeah, it just goes so much deeper. And all of this kind of plays into something that you guys talked about that I thought was such an interesting, I guess, connection between personal finance and going deeper, like we talked about. And especially for women, which we just brought up, is how diet culture played a major role in distorting women's values. Can you speak on that a little bit?
Yeah. So obviously, like, I am a woman of the early 2000s, late 90s. And so I grew up in a house that was obsessed, like both my parents were obsessed with their weight. And I was a chunky girl growing up. And so they were obsessed with my weight too.
Mm,
And so all of it became kind of this, you have to look this certain way because other people are saying you have to look the certain way, or
right.
you have to look this way because other people are saying it's healthy. Honestly, diet culture is not even rooted in health, it's just rooted in aesthetics. But that is so ingrained in us. And so dieting is super ingrained in us. And we see the same thing because nobody talked about money, but everybody talked about dieting. We just adopt the principles and the practices we're familiar with from other places, and we adopt them for our finances and our spending. And so we want to go 100%. If we can't go 100%, then we failed and we binge, right? That sentence can be used for food and spending and money. Or we like we just view intuitive eating is something that's gotten really popular, and we take the same approach with money. Like, you don't change something that you don't value. And so if you know what you value, you can intuitively consume, and it becomes more easier. It's a skill that has to be learned. It has to be trained. You're not going to be a good intuitive eater or a good intuitive spender right off the bat, right? But diet culture has ingrained in us that you got to go 100%. You got to be perfectly skinny and all of this stuff. And so it's this really difficult, like set of practices to rip yourself away from, both physically and financially. And so realizing why we do some of the things we do with money, because it's rooted in some of these things that have become routines, but were essentially at first like marketing, like campaigns. Once we do that, then we can it's easier to spend better.
Yeah, I'm thinking about this also from the decluttering side of things too, and that makes sense. I think so many of us were all or nothing, right? You're like, I'm not going to eat any sweets for a whole year, or whatever diet
Mm-hmm.
we're doing. I'm not going to eat any fat or any carbs, or it's this all or nothing. And then we do that, like you said, in our spending, and then, or in our decluttering, we say, I'm just going to get rid of it all, or I have to spend, every single night of the week going through everything I own, and then you burn out and you eat
Mm-hmm.
5 cheeseburgers, or you buy 10 things on Amazon, or you just throw everything in the corner in a pile of clutter and you're like, I can't, you know what I mean? And it's just,
Mm-hmm.
it's so interesting. And it's such a good point. And I think that so many of us that are our age, and other ages too, it does point back. That diet is so ingrained in us when we're concerned about our bodies and aesthetics and that kind of thing. So that makes a lot of sense to me. I want to move now into kind of this budgeting aspect of spending on what you love, because like you said, it does feel a little bit intimidating. That word deprivation that you use definitely feels on track for me. Like I struggle with it a lot. Like I'm quote good with money, right? Like I've never been in debt. I don't overspend, but when I try and keep a budget, I feel like I am trapped. I'm a little bird trapped in a cage, and I just want to fly free. You know what I mean? And I think to myself, I'm smart enough that I can kind of know how much income I have and spend it accordingly, especially because I've never been in debt. And so then the word budget freaks me out. So what is the problem with telling someone that a budget will solve their spending problems?
I mean, well, exactly what you said. I'm the same way. I have so much shame and probably like PTSD with budgeting from our debt payoff. Like, I don't keep a budget now. Like,
Oh,
same as you.
interesting.
Like, I don't keep a budget. Jill does. She loves her spreadsheet budget, but I don't, because I feel like having even a categorical, like for me at this time, I'm not trying to reach any like really big financial goals. A budget is a tool to reach financial goals faster. And if you're in a place where your goals are not financial, maybe they are familial or health, or we just wrapped up a huge renovation on a fixer upper, like when your goals are elsewhere, you can afford to have your attention there. So well, a lot of people, though, reading our book are going to have big financial goals. And so we do say that it is good to have a budget, but you can do it in a different way. So just like I was saying, language is so powerful. We know that there's so much like connotation wrapped up in the word budget. So we like to call it a spending plan. And you can have a values-based spending plan. So instead of having your coffee budget where you either spend it all or feel guilty on it, and there's no real intentional thought, there's no intuitive thought that goes into how you're spending. You're just, kind of, I think of like, if it fits my macros, like that whole mindset with food, like if it fits my budget, I'll spend it. No, we're trying to think intentionally. And so why don't we start with the intention why don't we start with the purpose instead of the thing? Why don't we change our categories to be values instead of things? Because that's what we're trying to change our mindset to being. Because if this is a spending plan, we need to think about why we're spending. We're thinking about what we're spending on, not how much. So we're changing it from a budget to a spending plan. And instead of having these categories that are arbitrary and meaningless, that just have numbers attached to them, we're thinking, okay, these are my highest values: family, friends, faith, fulfilling work. And everything goes under there. And then if you want to have more values, that's awesome. And some people who like don't have a traditional faith, they what, that's not for me. But like a lot of like travel, time outside, anything that like it feels spiritual for you, that would go in that category. So why don't we start with those things first? And that way we can see how much we have for each. And you can even put your mortgage and transportation in there. Mortgage definitely would go under family. Transportation would definitely go under fulfilling work, probably. Maybe also family if you're like toting kids around to multiple schools like I am. So, but yeah, you can put those expenses in different places. So not all your values will have the same amount under expenses. You decide what's most important to you, what you prioritize, and you get to decide that. And then your purchases become intentional. And we're thinking about values first, not stuff first. And it takes away the guilt and shame cycle that budgeting has, because there's no wrong answer. There's just kind of a limit. And once we hit the limit, then we can get creative with how we meet the need instead of how we get the stuff.
Yeah, what you're saying kind of reminds me of that intuitive eating, intuitive spending, intuitive decluttering piece of this, which is you won't need, and like you said, some people do need that when they have a spending goal, which I'm going to talk about and ask about in just a second. But like when you are just trying to make sure you're not overspending the income that you have, if you are intentional about it, then it becomes intuitive. It becomes more easy to move through life. And if you get tempted by something, to know if that's aligning with your values of those 4 F's. And then you can more easily say no without needing to go into your spreadsheet and say, does this fit exactly with the numbers that I have left? And like you said, it all starts to kind of become more natural. Like, I think that's been the case for me too when it comes to decluttering. It's not as hard. It's building a muscle, and being able to do it more intuitively, because I know my values. I know, what do I want to stand out? What is most important to me in my home, right? It's that I don't want to be spending time cleaning when I could be spending time with my family, right? I don't want to go through the decision fatigue of getting ready in the morning. I want to be able to grab my clothes and focus on what actually matters. And so then when I am tempted to buy a tchotchke for my house or to buy this new dress, I naturally am so in tune with those deeper core values that it's much easier to say no. And so that's what I'm hearing there when it comes to that intuitive spending. And I think that makes a lot of sense. I might be biased, but I'm pretty sure that I have like the best ad partners in the game because the things that I get to talk about and I get to try out for myself are truly non-cluttery and like the best things ever. And I'm going to share another one with you right now. It is AquaTrue, the new water purifier that both my husband and I are in love with. And in our home, we are big water people. My kids don't really get juice. They are not big milk drinkers. Like we are water people all the way. And as we know, our kids have to fill up their water bottles every single day and bring them to school, even though our generation didn't drink water until we were 18 years old and we survived. But anyway, water intake is obviously super important. And I just don't trust tap water. Like, I'm not trying to be bougie, but according to extensive research by the Environmental Working Group, virtually every home in America has harmful contaminants in its water. AquaTrue purifiers use a 4-stage reverse osmosis purification process, which I don't even know what that means, but it sounds pretty awesome. And it removes 15 times more contaminants than an ordinary pitcher filter. And it's specifically designed to combat chemicals like PFAs in your water, which we've all learned over the last couple years are detrimental to our health because we're essentially swallowing little tiny particles of plastic. And I'm really, really grateful that AquaTrue is certified to remove these contaminants so that I can feel like my kids are truly going to be healthy just from drinking water. Gosh, it sounds like it should be so simple, but it's just not. AquaTrue does have water purifiers to fit every type of home. So there's the installation-free countertop purifier, which we have and love, to also higher capacity purifiers that are under the sink. And one of the best parts is you don't have to change the filter every 2 to 3 months. Okay, these filters are affordable and you don't have to change them for about 6 months up to 2 years. Just one set of filters from their classic purifier makes the equivalent of 4,500 water bottles. That is less than 3 cents a bottle. Time for your goodies. Okay, so AquaTrue comes with a 30-day money-back guarantee, which makes that a fantastic gift option. Again, we're looking for clutter-free gifts around these parts, and a water filter is a clutter-free gift. And of course, my listeners receive 20% off any AquaTrue purifier. Just go to aquatrue.com. That's AQUATRU. So AquaTrue, but with like no E at the end of true. So aquatrue.com and enter the code PAIRING, PARING. There's no I in pair at checkout. That's 20% off any AquaTrue water purifier when you go to aquatrue.com and use promo code PARING. Let's go into that financial goal piece for those who do have those bigger financial goals that maybe a more traditional budget, even if it's values-based, might be really beneficial. How do we choose which financial goal to start with?
Yeah. So again, it also comes down to what you value. And we also get like the question a lot, how do I get my partner on board with my financial goal? So this
Yep.
will be twofold, this one answer. And it starts with what you want most in life. So when my husband and I paid off our debt, I did not want to. I did not want to live the best years of my life living under a rock, paying off debt because I thought it was going to take 5 years and I wanted to have kids in 5 years. And so I didn't want to spend my last kidless years just living in misery and deprivation. But he, instead of like pushing me or guilting me or trying to convince me with numbers, he asked me what I want most out of life. Like, what do you want personally and for the both of us? Because for the both of us, I wanted kids. But for personally, I actually wanted to foster because I was working in foster care. And for me personally, I mean, obviously it would be a family thing, but like that was a personal goal of mine. So not just what do you want for your relationship, what do you want for your family, but also what do you want personally? And kind of reverse engineer. How can we make it easier to both accomplish it and to live peacefully while in it? And so I just knew the payment for foster care is not high and the time commitment is very high. So I wanted income flexibility and I wanted employment flexibility. So that became a lot easier to not be beholden to an employer if we did not have the $500, $600, $700 a month debt payment. And so that's what really inspired me to get on board is when I realized I could get what I want faster and easier by just taking this little detour. And also saying like, maybe we don't have to pay off 100% of our debt. Maybe that's not what's going to make this easier. Maybe it's like just paying off the high interest debt. I know there's a camp that thinks all debt is bad, but debt is neutral. Debt is a tool. It can be good or bad. The same debt that some person thinks is good can be bad, and vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
It really just comes down to, okay, maybe debt payoff is our goal. We want to free up some of our income. So how much of our debt how much of our income do we need to free up, and how much of our debt do we need to pay down before we move on to this next goal that might be starting to invest, or saving for our kids, like college or car or whatever. So really, the all or nothing approach to financial goals doesn't work. You have to really reverse engineer what you want, and what you want can also change throughout the journey. So people make these elaborate 5, 10, 15, 20-year goals, and they're for nothing. They're a waste of time. Just look at what you want, look at what's ideal, and start to work towards that, and be flexible in between.
Right. We're constantly changing as human beings. If you had told me 5 years ago that I was going to have a whole business about paring down and decluttering, I would have been like, huh? What are you talking about? You know what I mean? Like I had a guest recently who said, we don't know our future selves. So it's really hard to make decisions for our future self.
Yep.
We can make good
Yep.
decisions that will benefit whoever we are in their future. But when we get
Mm-hmm.
maybe overly specific, or we go overly far in the future, then it might be detrimental, like you said. And so we can't do that all or nothing, which for someone like me is hard, because I do feel like I'm an all or nothing kind of a person. It's too tempting to then, swing the pendulum in the opposite direction or whatever. But, finding out more about myself, doing this inner work that you guys talk so much about, really helps us kind of live in that gray area a little bit more comfortably. It's not to say that we don't have our specific values, or we don't have our specific convictions about certain things, but it does mean that we're more flexible, like you said, and that's a gentler way to live. And it also, like you said, opens you up to more opportunity in the future. You're not like stuck in a plan that no longer works for you. And can you share about how you guys recommend this 90-day transaction inventory that we kind of touched on earlier? Like, what is that all about?
Yeah. So it is the precursor to a budget or spending plan. So many people say, start with a budget, get on a budget. If you want to change your finances, get on a budget. But again, that's a solution that looks at the how much, not the what, or, even for lack of a better question, the why. So we start with a 90-day transaction inventory that looks back over everything you've spent for the last 3 months, whether you had birthdays or holidays or anything. Like there is no perfect time to do a 90-day transaction inventory. Every day is the perfect day for a 90-day transaction inventory, because it's going to really encompass a lot of the nuance in your spending. So not everything, it's not going to be perfect, but it's going to encompass a lot of it. And then we look at these transactions. We recommend doing it on a spreadsheet. So just like taking your transactions and maybe downloading a CSV or copy pasting, and then you can sort by like alphabetical. You want to sort by alphabetical and time. So when you see like Starbucks, you see all your Starbuckses together, then you can look at the date and kind of say, okay, this day I was late for work and I was feeling stressed. This day I was meeting up with some friends from work. This day, so the same place can be made transactions for different reasons. And so the transaction inventory really helps you identify which of your transactions have been values based and which have not, so that you can first draw a line in the sand and say, hey, for the last 3 months, I've spent on this several times and it has not gotten me what I fully wanted. It's not been 100%, maybe 50%, maybe it's been nothing, maybe it's 0%. And you draw a line in the sand and say, I will no longer spend on this for this reason. It's not that I will no longer spend on it forever. That's a diet culture mentality. It's, I'm not going to spend on this for this reason anymore to get this. And then you think, how am I going to get this in the future when this opportunity arises? So the transaction inventory helps you make these identifications, and it also helps you plan in the future. Because when you know what you have encountered, you can plan for what you most likely will encounter in your life. And so that's a big a thing with impulse spending, and unplanned spending in general is a lack of preparation and or a lack of planning, and not even just like, Sunday all out meal planning or prepping, not stuff like that, but just like, when I feel this way in the past, I have just reverted to this coping mechanism. What can I do instead? And you just plan to make a different decision, and you keep planning until finally one of those decisions is the right one for you. And because finding healthier coping mechanisms isn't perfect the first time around, but you have to be willing to try and try, or you'll keep spending that money on things that aren't really getting you what you want. They're a poor substitute for healthy coping mechanisms.
I have like the funniest, weirdest analogy that's coming to mind is that in the same vein, like what you were saying, how you're not going to get it perfect when you're trying to, replace one habit with another. Is we decided we weren't going to drink like a glass of wine anymore in the evenings. I don't feel good anymore. I'm 36. Even half a glass of wine, I can't sleep. I'm like, what am I doing? But I was talking to my brother actually about this recently, and we were talking about how wine or your drink at the end of the night, if that's something you partake in, can feel like this signal. I am now relaxed. The kids are in bed. It's signaling that you can take a load off, right? And so replacing that signal can feel really hard, especially with something like a drink that's like a physical, like an oral, like fixation almost, right? And so at first I tried doing like cranberry and sodas, and I'd put it in a wine glass, so it kind of feel, and that was fine. It kind of worked. It kind of didn't. It was like, I still kind of crave something else because I didn't love the taste of it. It was kind of just like I had it in my hand. So it kind of helped, but it wasn't really scratching the itch as much. And then I forget what else I tried, but finally I realized, this is going to sound silly. Now every night I sit down and I have my Froyo bar. It's the Yasso brand, and I get my chocolate chip cookie dough Froyo bar, and I sit down and I enjoy that thing. And that is my signal at the end of the night, because it's something that I enjoy just as much as a glass of wine. It tastes really yummy, and I still feel good, right? Like, it's not so much sugar and so heavy and big. It's not a big old bowl of ice cream with whipped cream on top. It's just a little Froyo bar that tastes yummy, and that is now my signal. That is what I replaced. But it took me multiple iterations of figuring out what my new quote coping mechanism or whatever it was going to be is. And I love how you say that. Like, when we look forward to, not looking forward, like excited about something, but we look forward to what might happen in our future, and what might tempt us to make an impulse purchase, to be gentle with ourselves and say, okay, I'm going to try this. Maybe that won't work. Maybe I'm still going to feel really tempted. Maybe I'm still going to make the purchase, or maybe I'm going to just feel really, deprived or whatever, to try something new next time, instead of just saying, well, I got to get that coffee every single time because that's the only thing that's going to make me happy in the morning, instead of trying new things over and over again. And when you were talking about that 90-day transaction, let's say the Starbucks example, seeing that all together and how that relates to the impulse purchase of identifying what different things were happening on the day, is that what you would consider habit spending? You talk about habit spending in the book. Is that kind of a visual of that?
Yeah, you can definitely figure it out from your 90-day transaction inventory. And your story is a perfect example of the habit spending. And your solution to it was great. Like, you kept trying until you found something. And yes, it's a little less expensive than wine, but when you looked at the what instead of the how much, when we look at the how much, we're like guilting ourselves for drinking wine every night because it's not healthy, and it costs a lot. And so then we just take it out because we quote unquote should. But when you look at the what, then you can make intentional decisions to get the same need met, get the same value met, for less expensive, or maybe it's the same price, but maybe you don't quote unquote save any money, but you don't feel guilty about the purchase because now it's meeting the values of better health, and it's meeting the same enjoyment. And so it's just a totally different mindset. And so we look at our 90-day transaction inventory to kind of start to become aware of some of these habits, that we're doing, these mindless, transactions that we don't think about, we just do. Like, I always stop, here on my way home from work, or I always get coffee on the way to meet my mom. And we look at the triggers from the habit loop. If you're familiar with Charles Duhigg or James Clear, they have their habit loop. And the first is always cue or trigger. And it's, time, person, preceding event, stuff like that. And so we can actually look at those triggers or cues and align them with these purchases. And they can tell us more about why we're spending so that we can create solutions and plans that get at the what, not the how much.
I love that. And one of these solutions that you guys have named so adorably is the impulse intervention list. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. I love I loved coming up with the name impulse intervention. I didn't need to, but I wanted to.
It's just more fun that way.
Right. Yeah. I love alliterations. We're frugal friends. Like it was great. But it's just a list of different things to do with different, I call them sizes. That's the list you're referring to, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. So when you are going to make an impulse purchase, it's not like going to the farmer's market and impulse buying bread is different from lying in your bed and impulse buying on Amazon, right? So our impulse purchases have different sizes, quote unquote. So we've got the large ones that require you to leave your house and go somewhere, like an event or an activity. We've got the medium-sized ones that just involve you kind of moving your body in some fashion. Maybe you are, walking around your house or something. And then you've got the small ones that you don't have to get out of. You can literally just be on your phone, not moving in bed. So when you are looking at your 90-day transaction inventory and identifying these like impulse purchases, you can kind of categorize them by size too, and say, this is a big one. I find myself every weekend going to brunch or a festival, or I impulse buy a lot at big activities, or I'm just like an impulse shopper on Instagram. Like I scroll Instagram and it made me buy it. Find out what you're most prone to. Could be all three. But then you can create an intervention that is of a comparable size. Obviously, if scrolling in bed is, your downfall, getting up and going for a run is not going to be the intervention or the solution. Great for those medium-sized activities that make you impulse spend, not for lying in bed. So at that point, it's playing a game on your phone or creating doing something creative that in a journal. So it's creating something that requires as much body movement as the impulse spending would. And we have a list of different ways you would impulse spend, and then different interventions that you can do that kind of match the size. I
just love that approach. It is so practical and it's so real, right? Because I think we think, oh, if you are sitting in bed, shopping on Amazon, get outside and go for a walk. And that is such a big jump, like you said, of what energy you're expending.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, no, I want to be in bed right now. Thank you so much. But that's one of the reasons I love your book. I was so grateful you guys kind of sent me that copy to look through because, and like I said, I already pre-ordered mine and I can't wait to get my hands on it and highlight it to death. But it's just so practical. There's so much of that kind of stuff in the book that's just good ideas for a realistic way to approach our spending that just doesn't feel like you're just trying to muscle through it, because that just doesn't work. There's so much I want to talk more about. By the way, I also, from listening to your podcast, read Amanda Montell's book, The Age of Magical Overthinking, because I loved your guys' interview with her and I was just fascinated by the biases. And I love that you guys in your book talk about the complexity bias and how that leads to decision fatigue, which makes us spend more money. I'm going to leave that as a teaser for my followers here because there's so much in your book that is so incredibly helpful. But before I get to the two questions that I ask everyone at the end of every episode, I want to ask one more question to you, and that is, what is the biggest piece of advice you'd give to someone who struggles to spend their money responsibly?
It would be to focus on the what, not the how much. Stop guilting yourself and thinking that you're bad with money because of the amount of money you spend, and make it your goal to live your life as full as possible and get as much of your values, because I guarantee what you want most is what money can't buy. So why are you using money to try to buy it?
I love that. Yeah, and that's another thing in your book. You talk about the intangible versus the tangible, and it's really those intangible things that we're seeking at the end of the day, but it's so much easier to get distracted by the tangible, thinking that that's going to get us what we want, and it's just unsatisfying. So thank you for that. Okay, now, what is something that you are currently paring down? This can be physical, like a decluttering moment, or this can be paring down an idea or a belief, anything like that.
Oh, I just 2 days ago got rid of a lot of my son's books. He's 5, and they send him home with books from school all the time, which is fantastic. But he's gotten so many books that it's hard for him to choose books at night because he gets overwhelmed. So we got rid of like a stack like 2 feet high of books, and and kind of organize them a little bit better so it feels less overwhelming, so he can choose. Because for like a few weeks he was like, you pick out the books. Like, he wouldn't pick out the books, and so like I saw what was happening, so I was like, okay, it's time to get rid of some of these books so he can make this decision more easily.
I love that. It's so interesting to me how we can see in our kids a clear reflection of our own experiences, like when it comes to having too much clutter, because they can't concentrate and they can't choose and they can't pick. And yeah, and it's really, really tough. And it's so interesting you mentioned books, because I always get scared when I tell people to declutter books, because people are highly opinionated about that. And I'm a book girly. I am obsessed with our library. I often check out way more than I can actually read, and then I have to return them and then like check them out again in a month when I have the time. I love books. What is something that you are currently looking forward to?
Okay, so I have a conference that I go to every year in October, and I typically speak on it. This is the first year that I'll be speaking on the main stage. And
Congrats.
it feels like a reunion every year of just, it's called FinCon, and it's financial media professionals. So writers, podcasters, YouTubers, influencers, and it just feels like a reunion every year of money nerds. And it is the highlight of my year. It is one of the only conferences that I go to. It is the only conference I go to consistently. Like, I will try others, but I never stick with them. But I just love it, and I'm so excited.
That's so exciting. And where can everyone find you online and buy your book and listen to your podcast, all the good stuff?
Yeah, so you can find Frugal Friends podcast wherever you're listening to this podcast, and head to buywhatyoulovebook.com, and you can pre-order the book from your book retailer of choice, including Amazon and bookshop.org, to support indie bookstores. And yeah, we really hope that you like it. Buywhatyoulovebook.com.
Yes, that's where I went to get my book. And I love that you guys support indie bookstores. It just made the buying process so much easier. And for someone like me, who I really am trying to I'm not perfect at it, but incorporate just ethical choices in all of my spending, it was really cool that you guys made that kind of a seamless process. So I'll have all of that in the show notes. And Jen, thank you so much for being here. Tell Jill I say hi. Tell her I'm your guys' biggest fan. I've literally told people on my podcast to listen to yours before. The Backstock episode I did came out like a week after you guys did your warehouse spending episode. And I had friends be like, oh my gosh, this is just like Frugal Friends pod. Anyways, I just love you guys so much. I'm definitely been fangirling here today. So I just appreciate you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Shannon. It was such a joy.
You just listened to an episode of Paring Down with me, Shannon Leyko. If you enjoyed the show, it would mean the world if you can leave a review wherever you listen and share this episode with a friend. Those reviews really are what keeps a podcast on its feet for the long haul, and I will read every single one with a huge smile on my face. So thank you ahead of time. If you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to hit subscribe. Also, be sure to follow along on Instagram at paring_down, where I offer lots of tips and inspiration for paring down, along with what's new here on the podcast. Till next time.